Does Wuthering Waves version 2 live up to the hype? I feel like I have a different perspective on it than most of the takes I've seen. I played WuWa from day one and loved it, but while I kept playing for the first 6 months, over time I enjoyed it less and ended up taking a break for a few weeks after the release of version 1.4. When version 2 dropped a month later, I was tempted to try it again, but was a bit too preoccupied with figuring out why I was so disappointed by the final act of Natlan to give it any attention. But some friends who still played kept saying it was a fantastic update and a huge step up which really deserved a second chance, and many people online were raving about it. So over a week after the update dropped, it was time for me to discover Rinascita. While I enjoyed WuWa from day one, right from the start there were some aspects which I felt ambivalent about. I shared my first impressions a few weeks after it was first released, but overall it felt like a pretty solid start despite the technical hiccups. Soul 3 didn't quite capture my imagination as much as I'd hoped, and the story quests were a big disappointment despite some great ideas and very polished animations, but the core of the game for me was the combat, and I found it very satisfying to play. Over time, however, many parts of the game which I had initially enjoyed lost their shine, and the game slowly turned into a chore, which eventually led to me dropping it. Let's talk through each key aspect of the game: exploration, combat, progression systems, endgame, characters, and story, and see how my take on each changed over time, and find out which parts version 2 has improved. First, the most important part of an open world game for me, exploration. WuWa immediately stood out due to the ease of traversal, most notably the characters being able to sprint straight up walls. For many, this was a huge selling point, but for me, it's emblematic of why I had mixed feelings about the game. On one hand, after spending countless hours exploring open worlds which either make climbing difficult via slow animations and restrictive stamina gauges, or worse, restrict traversal to specific paths marked with yellow paint, it felt incredibly freeing to sprint straight up a mountain and reach the top in no time. While there is a stamina system for climbing, so much of the traversal seemed designed to be as convenient as possible, and it was a breeze to run around the world collecting things and hunting echoes. But, on the other hand, this stripped the exploration of much of its gameplay loop. In other games, while I do hate it when they have a stamina gauge outside of combat for anything other than climbing, I've actually enjoyed stamina-focused climbing to varying degrees. It can be a fun challenge to gauge whether you have enough stamina to reach the next safe spot, or to make trade-offs between climbing speed and stamina consumption, and it can be a big contributor to making the world feel like a large and hostile place. Some of the best exploration gameplay can be summed up as the player versus the world. I played an indie game called Jusant which took this to the extreme and focused entirely on in-depth stamina mechanics supplemented by strategic use of various climbing tools as you slowly make your way up a gigantic cliff face for hours on end. That level of detail made for a fantastic experience where the climbing itself was an engaging challenge, but this would be difficult to integrate into a truly open world. It's not something I had expected from a game like WuWa, of course, though I feel like there's a decent argument that a major reason that climbing stamina gameplay gets so frustrating so quickly for so many people is that almost all games which have it fail to add any form of player progress to that system other than increasing the size of the stamina bar. Either way, the real point is that there's a wide spectrum here. At one extreme, you have games where there is no gameplay other than traversal mechanics, while at the other extreme, the traversal is intended to be as frictionless as possible. Many people feel that friction is inherently a bad thing, but that's just not always true. WuWa leans towards freedom rather than friction, and that is also not inherently a bad thing. What matters is how it affects the gameplay. WuWa's freedom of traversal absolutely shines when contrasted to other, more restrictive games, but it quickly fades into the background once you start playing regularly. For many people, the end result is that they get to skip the parts of running around the world that they found painful and go straight to the thing they want to do: play quests, solve puzzles, and fight enemies. I can appreciate that freedom, but in the long run, it makes me feel like I'm skipping across the surface of the world, almost like I was never really there. I've yet to find an open world game which gets the climbing the mountain part right in a way which keeps feeling fun over time, but the way WuWa removes that friction doesn't work for me either. Since a large part of the appeal for open world games is the feeling of exploring a new world, my feeling after playing for a few months was that it was a little too far towards the end of the spectrum to keep me entertained. Mount Firmament did capture my attention more than the rest of the map, however. Its aesthetic was much more striking, and some of the exploration mechanics it introduced were much better balanced for my tastes. The same theme echoes when it comes to the loot mapper. Open world games are at their best when they use subtle visual cues to subconsciously guide the player towards any interesting things for them to discover, chests included. In other games, I regularly reach 100% map completion before I even realized it, without using anything like a loot mapper or a treasure compass to mop up any missing content. WuWa's world always felt fairly mixed on this to me, and it's tough to express why. I'm curious whether the loot mapper is to blame. When a game includes a mechanic which marks every single nearby chest on a map, it no longer matters whether only a tiny percent of people will organically find any given chest, because there's an easy way to guarantee all players will find them if they want to. Sadly, using the loot mapper takes away that feeling of discovery for me and reduces exploration gameplay to just mechanically working through a checkbox exercise. Since it felt like I was given a choice between missing out on much of the chest and missing out on any sense of enjoyment, I ended up just not bothering at all. In Rinascita, the loot mapper itself has been significantly nerfed. Random chests are less common, and instead there are more activities in the world to have fun with. Technically, there's an even more comprehensive menu which provides a literal list of checkboxes to tick if you want to max out your exploration, but the intuitive exploration was so much better in the new regions that I never felt the need to use it. That, hopefully, points towards a much better balance. The experience of exploring is greatly improved, but you still have that exhaustive guide available if you want to clean up the last few things in each area. I do have mixed feelings about the lack of chests in the open world, and the plague of mimics all over the place just rubs it in that so much of the world is pretty empty, but overall I've had a good time. Which leads us to the most eye-catching addition in Rinascita, flight. Given that the level of freedom we had in version 1 ended up eroding my enjoyment of its exploration, you can see why I was apprehensive at the addition of even more freedom. Flying in particular is tough for open world games. It's the kind of thing that makes even the biggest games feel small, and it can make exploration feel inconsequential. Fortunately, WuWa absolutely nailed it. After spending the previous weeks flying around Natlan using Chaska, my first few moments with WuWa's flight mechanic were just utter confusion. Physics? Momentum? Stamina? It was very different to what I was accustomed to, and yet it took only a few seconds to get the hang of it and only a minute or two to be truly impressed. Once you launch into the air, there is of course a fantastic sense of speed, and you quickly start trading altitude for even more momentum. If you're going fast enough, you can tilt back and regain that altitude, resulting in an undulating flight path much like the flight of smaller birds. You can also boost your speed at the cost of consuming more stamina. The controls quickly felt very natural, like this was how flight should work in a game like this. And then, for me, it settled into that perfect balance where the sort of gameplay loop of managing altitude and flight stamina didn't require any conscious thought, but provided just enough friction that flying around the world felt engaging. Moments spent speeding through obstacles at the bottom of the arc can be utterly exhilarating, and yet others spent at the top of the arc have a relaxing sense of calm. I'll be shocked if this ever gets old. Now, I just wish we could fly the same way in Jinsho as well. While taking flight really grabs the attention, the other aspects of Rinascita's map and exploration do deserve some focus. Much of the new area is fantastic. The cities are actually well populated, there are a ton of different things to do all over the place, some of the puzzles are so much fun, and much of the content which can technically be considered exploration gameplay, since it counts towards your map exploration, is a bunch of different types of combat. WuWa is definitely playing into its strengths here. Aesthetically, the new area feels very different to the old, and it has many of those wow moments which had been oddly missing for me in the first region. The only thing which feels a little off is that there's something about it which feels oddly disjointed, with regions which don't quite feel like they belong next to their neighbors, though this feeling could just be an inevitable consequence of being able to zoom from place to place so quickly now that we can fly. And special mention to this exploration quest off towards the edge of the map where, after you awaken a boss enemy and start to chase it, it starts destroying the surroundings, smashing its way through bridges and launching boulders and enemies through the air. That was very cool on so many levels, and I'd love to see more like that. When placed next to the older regions, Rinascita's aesthetic may be a little jarring, and while on the whole the exploration still isn't perfect, it is an absolutely huge improvement. Next, the combat system. Much like the exploration, this is another area where WuWa stands out, a reason many people absolutely love the game, yet I have mixed feelings about it. When the game first launched, I loved it. The emphasis on skill and timing in combat can sometimes introduce a lot of problems, but WuWa's dodging system is absolutely fantastic, and the parrying can also be pretty great. The early days of learning how it works and getting comfortable with it were a lot of fun. However, once I reached the point where the only remaining challenge was the endgame, my experience with the combat kinda diverged from what the most vocal people say about it. In this kind of game, I see combat complexity as having multiple dimensions, and WuWa's combat leans heavily into only one, mechanical complexity. It has a heavy focus on skill, timing, and learning the moveset of both your characters and your enemies. I found this very fun in the moment at first, as the challenge of getting to grips with the characters and enemies can be quite engaging, and found the dodging mechanic particularly intuitive and satisfying. However, I only enjoy this type of complexity up to a certain point. High-level play is a more challenging incarnation of the same principles. Getting good is all about memorizing the movesets of enemies so that you can really nail the timing of counters and parries, which then let you make the most of the most powerful combos and rotations of your characters. Since each character has unique animations, the delay between pressing a button and the hit frames is slightly different, so anytime you have a different character on field, you need to completely adjust your approach if you want to successfully parry. Also, some characters can't parry at all, or only parry with, for example, their third or fourth attack. Combine that with the speed and variety of movesets the more difficult bosses make, and you kinda need to build up muscle memory separately for each character you want to use. For many, this is the depth they want to see in combat. It makes each character feel different. It means there's a very high skill ceiling, and it rewards dedication and in-depth knowledge. I enjoyed it when I was in my honeymoon period with WuWa, but it turns out that in the long run, I just do not find the grind of repeating the same battle over and over engaging at all. I hear that for people who enjoy this, when they do manage to really nail a fight against a difficult enemy, it feels incredibly satisfying. For me, when that happens, instead of an adrenaline rush, I always just think, was that it? And feel like it wasn't worth the time. And unfortunately, the game doesn't make it easy for someone who doesn't inherently love that type of challenge to get into it. For example, when fighting the tactical holograms, I might have been able to enjoy the process of learning their mechanics in depth if it wasn't for the fact that every time you fail, you need to go through the effort of regaining your energy for all your characters if you want them available from the start of the next fight. If they had refilled the energy, it might have just tipped into something I'd have gotten hooked on. Instead, it was just too frustrating. It's important to emphasize that this focus is the entire reason the game appeals to some people. I'm not saying the design decisions here are bad in any objective sense, just trying to share why they don't work as well for me. The emphasis on this type of complexity slowly wore away at my enjoyment of the combat over time, though more on that when we get to the endgame section a little later on. Another dimension of complexity is character builds. Despite the amount of time and effort this eats up, I personally don't think of it as something that WuWa really leans into in any kind of satisfying way. Character and forte talent levels are linear, weapons are gacha, echo stats are endless RNG, and there's surprisingly little flexibility when it comes to echo sets. None of this gives players much control. At best, we can pick a weapon and an echo set and then grind for the stats we want, but the end result is a net negative for me. Build complexity is at its best when you have a host of different options, providing lots of control over how the build fits together, plus tangible effects on the gameplay, which creates opportunities for creativity and innovation in how players approach the game. In WuWa, from what I can tell, there's usually only one ideal build for each character, and the equipment system just boils down to a grind towards that singular goal. People love the lack of 50-50 for weapons, but in this game, the free weapons are so trash that if you want any semblance of the power level you'd expect, you're basically required to spend your astrites on the weapon banner, especially for DPS characters. Ignoring that one gripe about the weapons, the one positive thing I have to say about builds overall is that characters are generally strong enough, even with mediocre builds, as long as you're skilled enough. So the really painful parts of the equipment system can largely be skipped. Gear systems in gacha games are generally pretty awful, and I wish the developers would innovate and find some way to hook players on that treadmill of randomized incremental gains, which is not pure pain to interact with. One innovation WuWa brought here is that you can farm echoes in the open world, but in practice, it's even more of a grind to endlessly trek across the map to hunt them, especially because you still need to spend wave plates in order to get the EXP and tuners to actually level them and reveal their substats. If anything, looking at the world and seeing a near endless supply of potential echoes to farm just makes the whole endeavor feel even more futile to me. I could not dislike echoes more. I'd honestly love to hear from people who actually enjoy it, since at this point I legitimately cannot see any redeeming qualities. My personal favorite dimension from similar combat games is team complexity, and sadly, it's one which I felt is a little neglected in WuWa. It exists in the interaction between the combat system, the characters' kits, and how they fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. I love getting a clear understanding of how multiple characters work and figuring out unusual ways to make them complement each other to create teams which are more powerful than you'd expect. This was the type of complexity I was hoping for after reaching the endgame content, since it's the kind of thing which captures my imagination imagination and gets me thinking about the game even when I'm doing anything else. Sadly, I've never felt it was really there in WuWa. Swapping characters out for different options has only minor effect on how the team works, and any synergies and trade-offs when building teams are fairly surface level. Each DPS has a very limited list of ideal team members. For example, they might specifically need coordinated attacks or someone who charges forte quickly, and there's not much scope for variety within those roles. It's certainly possible that I'm just missing something, but after months of playing daily, despite enjoying the mechanical complexity in the moment, the lack of team complexity meant that the combat just didn't capture my imagination in the way that I had hoped for. And when it comes to the endgame content, I again have mixed feelings. I dislike the Tower of Adversity overall. Time challenges are rarely my cup of tea, and the bar is set too high for me to enjoy it. The two normal towers are fun enough that I do them anyway to gain the rewards, but it doesn't feel worth grinding the boss enemies to get familiar with their timing just to be able to get all the stars. After all, I've got so many other things to spend my time on which I actually enjoy. Instead, I end up with somewhere around 22 to 24 stars and skip the Hazard Tower entirely. The tower's vigor system deserves some praise though. You can mix and match different teams on the same floor, go back and swap in something completely different for one floor to free up a character without having to start over, and even share equipment between characters if you really want to. This removes many points of friction which can ruin similar modes in other games for people who enjoy this kind of content, and on balance, the tower is probably better overall than my personal dislike for it really conveys. The tactical holograms are a similar story. They're very much a test of your mechanical skill and ability to memorize enemy movesets, a clear example of the kind of content which is just not aimed at me. If you enjoy getting your head smashed in over and over as you learn the perfect timing for an enemy, then you'll probably love them. The Elusive Realm, on the other hand, I absolutely love. It's the only endgame in any similar game that I happily spend time replaying just for fun, even after collecting all the important rewards. It really leans into the strengths of WuWa's combat systems, sprinkles in some player choice and differentiated reward systems, and builds up to a finale where your character feels incredibly powerful even though you're fighting massively overpowered bosses. My only real complaint with the Elusive Realm is that it's not always available. It's been missing entirely in the week or two since I re-downloaded the game, and I sorely miss it. When it comes to combat, version 2 generally brings more of the same. More characters, more weapons, more echo sets, more enemies. I enjoyed many of the new combat challenges scattered around the overworld, and the Nightmare Echoes are a cool way to add new options to older characters. On balance, it's pretty great, and if you're in the target audience, then there's a ton of depth within the areas it's aiming to get right to keep it engaging for a long time. But sadly, I prefer an emphasis on other types of complexity, so while it's still fun, it's not quite enough to really capture my imagination. A game which gets both right would be the dream for me, but sadly I've yet to find one which manages that. And I really wish they would keep the Elusive Realm available. It's by far and away the standout in the game for me. I had really high hopes for WuWa's story. I love sci-fi, and post-apocalyptic setting can be incredibly interesting. I'd heard that Kuro's other games had rough starts but improved a ton over time, so I was hoping, with all that experience, they could maybe be able to start strong this time and get even better from there. The cinematics really sold me on this. They are absolutely stunning and really raised the bar for what to expect from a game like this. And interestingly, the cinematography and character animation outside of the cinematics was top tier too. I often found myself thinking we had transitioned into a cutscene when actually it was just some deftly executed camera work within the game engine itself. Unfortunately, this was all style over substance, and the story became a major reason for me quitting the game. The narrative never hooked me in, the characters never caught my eye, and the conversations just washed past me and never stuck in my memory. From the get-go, the Rover's treatment by the other characters was just not my cup of tea. It felt like they had some inexplicable magnetism, which took so much precedence over the rest of the characters' personalities that they came across as hollow. As the story progressed, this got more and more pronounced, and the female leads in particular went from inexplicably trusting to inexplicably infatuated with the Rover. Every step along the way just felt like it was emphasizing that I was not the target audience. And before anyone who loved this aspect gets upset, let's make it clear, I do not expect every game to be tailored to my tastes. I've got Infinity Nikki for that. But when people ask me what made me lose interest in the game I had previously been super excited about, it's important to be honest. The perfect example of this was Camellia. I loved her design from the moment we first caught a glimpse of her and waited impatiently for her to come out since day one. But when she did come out, after pulling for her, I watched her story through another player's stream and basically uninstalled the game. Okay, not actually because of that, but it was enough another source of disappointment that finally tipped the scales. Maybe some people loved it, and maybe it's my own fault for having different expectations for what her character might be like, but turning her into just another rover simp slightly soiled her for me. Camellia is still my favorite, and I like playing her, but her characterization just completely severed any emotional connection I felt towards her. My experience with her is a more extreme example of how almost all the characters came across to me, and since they didn't capture my attention, I had no investment in the story, and I felt no urge to pull. The rare exception is Alto, which is why I play him a lot, but the rest just left me uninterested. Over time, the character designs seem to be getting progressively more fan servicey, and the lack of male characters has caused some discussions on Reddit. All of this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does emphasize that I might not be the target audience of the game, which is always a little disappointing when there's so much of it which feels so close to being exactly what I'd want. All of this left me less and less interested in the story over time. After trying my best for the first few patches, I have to admit I ended up using the skip button. And this experience proved to me just how bad a skip button can be for these games. It's something people often cry out for when it's missing, or praise it when it's available. As someone who has serious complaints about the slop dialogue prevalent in gacha games, I was firmly on the side of people who are in favor of this feature. However, after my experience with WuWa, I'm no longer quite so sure. Once you start pressing skip, it's hard to recapture any level of investment in the plot. After all, you don't really know what's going on anymore, and if you're not invested in the plot, you'll never get to know the characters. Even if you enjoy other aspects of the game, lacking any connection to the characters in a gacha game really sucks any sense of purpose in playing. In WuWa's case, that didn't feel like much of a loss for me due to the problems I just mentioned, but it still contributed to the game feeling hollow to me. After all, what's a story game if you don't keep up with the story? I heard rave reviews of Rinascita's story, but was very apprehensive about it. Many people enjoyed parts of the earlier story which I had just bounced right off. Even so, I resolved to avoid the skip button and give it my full attention in the hopes that it would finally capture some storytelling magic. Rinascita's story is a noticeable improvement on all counts, with much improved storytelling and pacing, and it's particularly welcome to see the characters interact with one another rather than being entirely focused on the rover. However, I'm still a little underwhelmed. It's not bad, and I appreciate the leap in quality, but despite that, it still failed to get me invested in anything that was happening and ended up feeling like a bit of a slog towards the end. If version 1 was a 2 out of 10 for me, and I was hoping for an 8 out of 10, I'd maybe give Rinascita a solid 6. It may be that this is because Carlotta echoed the issues I had in the earlier chapters, or because I still don't particularly like any of the character designs, so I'll still hold out hope that later chapters will really suck me in. While Carlotta stands out since she was center stage for so much of the story so far, the same is true for the other characters. We didn't get to know all that much about Zani, Brandt, Rocha, or even Phoebe, for example, and I still don't feel much of a connection to any of them. I do actually like Brandt though, so perhaps if he's more central in the upcoming patch, it'll start working a little better for me. The setup also appears very black and white, despite the Montellis having such mafia vibes. Maybe that's just because we're early on in the arc and we'll see more of morally grey narrative emerge over time. Many people will argue that it's unfair to have high expectations of a gacha game's narrative. I wholeheartedly disagree, but that's a discussion best left for another time. Overall, Wuthering Waves is a game I keep wanting to enjoy a lot. I waited for it for a long time, and so much of it feels like it's right up my alley, but I always find myself doubting whether it's actually for me. Many of the parts which don't appeal to me are objectively done really well, the combat's mechanical complexity being the perfect example, and some of the other decisions are likely perfectly tuned to appeal to a different audience. I still hold out hope that WuWa will broaden its appeal just a little bit, since if it does, then it could be such a blast for people like me. Unless it does, while it comes close, it doesn't quite land. Until next time.